Wait. They think what? They think if they take Hawaii, it will end the war? Wow. No, that's not over-optimistic. That's just plain stupid. Okay. April 11th, 1942. It has managed to hold out for over 3 months under appalling conditions. Food shortages to the point of starvation, desperately short on ammo, constant enemy artillery, powerful enemy ground assaults, rampant tropical disease, but it couldn't hold out forever. This week comes the fall of Bataan. I'm Indy Neidell. This is World War II. Last week, the British launched raids against civilian targets in Germany and military ones in occupied France. A new Axis bombing offensive began on Malta, and the Japanese gained ground in Burma while preparing for a final push against Allied forces in Bataan. They also sent their mighty carrier fleet, the Kido Butai, into the Indian Ocean on a raiding mission. That continues and even comes to its end this week. On the 5th, the Japanese carriers launch 127 planes in a raid on Colombo, thinking the British Eastern Fleet will be in port. It is not. The British have general advance warning of the raid, and Admiral Leighton in Colombo orders ships put to sea and dispersed to not be caught in the harbor. 3 ships are sunk and 3 damaged, and 20 of the 41 fighters the British send up are shot down. Thing is, James Somerville, British fleet commander, knows of the whole Japanese Indian Ocean operation, but he only thinks the Japanese have 2 carriers here until this raid. Now he knows that they have more. In fact, they have 5 of the 6 fleet Japanese carriers. Only Kaga is not with them. Somerville's fleet is divided into 2 groups. Force A is the faster and has his 2 modern carriers, Formidable and Indomitable. The heavy cruisers Cornwall and Dorsetshire were separated from this force and were sent to Colombo, but then ordered on the 4th to rejoin Force A as soon as they can. They are shadowed on the 5th, however, by Japanese planes and are both sunk at 2 in the afternoon. On the 6th, the Japanese attack shipping in the Bay of Bengal, sinking 83,000 tons of it. On the 9th, they launch a raid on Trincomalee. They also sink the old British carrier Hermes in the area and several other small ships. That day, though, 9 Blenheim bombers attack the Japanese carrier fleet by total surprise, dropping their bombs toward Akagi. They do not score any hits, but this is the first time Kido Butai has faced a concerted air attack. Since Pearl Harbor, actually, it's traveled like 80,000 kilometers and has had nothing but wins at Darwin, Rabaul, and now Ceylon and the Bay of Bengal, all for the loss of a dozen planes. The carriers do now need repair, maintenance work, and rest for the crews, so their operation ends the 10th. They have sunk 112,000 tons of merchant shipping here, 1 carrier, 2 cruisers, and 4 smaller Royal Navy warships. The British Eastern Fleet vacates the region and will now operate out of Kenya. The Japanese also have success on land this week. On the 5th, they take Mount Samat in the Philippines. Bataan cannot hold out much longer. On the 7th, General Jonathan Wainwright withdraws as much force as he can to Corregidor Island. 2,000 manage to cross over before the Japanese take the little port of Mariveles. The night of the 8th, Field Commander Edward King calls his staff together. 9 a.m. the 9th, he unconditionally surrenders all Allied forces on Luzon at Japanese headquarters. This is 76,000 men taken prisoner, 12,000 of them Americans. In spite of what they've recently gone through, for many of them, it now gets worse. The Japanese logistics break down since they capture 3 times the amount of people they prepared for. They also assumed the prisoners would have rations of their own, which they don't. The appalling result was that the already starving, ill, and exhausted men now faced the nightmare trek up the jungle trails of Bataan with little or no food to sustain them. Herded like driven cattle under the bayonets of the guards, the 65 miles that the survivors completed on foot was truly to deserve its awful place in history as the Bataan Death March. Stragglers would be mercilessly clubbed. Those dying from disease and malnutrition were left by the wayside, and men who appeared to be succumbing were buried alive by their comrades at gunpoint. The Japanese reserved their worst brutality for the unfortunate Filipinos. In one orgy of savagery, nearly 300 were bayoneted. They were among the more than 7,000 who never finished that terrible march. The rest will have to get used to life behind barbed wire as POWs. Wainwright still holds out in Corregidor with some 13,000 men total, and scattered areas of the islands do so with guerrilla activity. But Japan's first operational phase of attacks and conquests is over, and there has been serious dispute over what the second phase is to be. The Army wants to stop advancing, but the Navy wants not only to continue, but win a decisive battle with the Americans at sea before they can rebuild their fleet. The Navy staff proposed occupying New Guinea before an eventual invasion of Australia already a couple months ago. The Army said it didn't have the 100 divisions and hundreds of transports that would require. The Navy did get Army agreement to cooperate in occupying New Guinea. But just after that, Isoroku Yamamoto, who commands the combined fleet and came up with the Pearl Harbor plan, said what they really needed to do was hit the mid-Pacific. And everybody listens to him now because Pearl Harbor. So his staff made plans to take Hawaii. But they soon realized that that is beyond Japan's powers. So instead, the combined fleet staff came up with a plan to attack the British in Ceylon and gain Indian Ocean supremacy and then invade India. And that, combined with a German drive through the Middle East, would knock Britain out of Asia. But Adolf Hitler isn't keen on that. So that grand strategy was revised down into Operation C, these Indian Ocean raids. The Army is still arguing to prioritize China, and Yamamoto is planning for a mid-Pacific offensive to lure the Americans out to their destruction. The small-scale American raids we've seen the past couple of months have convinced Japan that one real priority should be strengthening their defense perimeter in the south. And those raids have also delayed the New Guinea adventure. So they really want to stop Allied actions in the Coral Sea and cut the supply line bringing U.S. troops to Australia, which means they have to take Fiji, Samoa, and New Caledonia. So Tokyo's been planning for this, but now Yamamoto gums up the works again because his plans are now more focused and involve an offensive against Midway Atoll to bring out the U.S. fleet into that big battle. Well, right now, it's all coming to a head at naval headquarters in Tokyo. John Costello goes over the debate in the Pacific War. Commander Miyu for the Navy staff. The combined fleet's view that the seizure of Midway by threatening Hawaii would effectively undermine America's will to fight and thus pave the way to negotiated peace is considered far too optimistic. He says that with the current Indian Ocean operation and refueling and refitting the carriers, there's no way they could meet Yamamoto's June date. And attacking Fiji and Samoa would bring out the U.S. fleet into the big battle anyhow, so let's do that. Watanabe, Yamamoto's staff gunnery officer, says the Midway strategy will draw out the enemy and destroy it. But even if the U.S. doesn't take the bait, then Japan's perimeter will be Midway and the Aleutians, and that's a good thing. When the Navy staff says only by attacking south can they cut the transport lines with Australia, Watanabe says the mid-Pacific plan would destroy all the American carriers, and without them, the transport line can't be maintained anyhow. Watanabe leaves no doubt that Yamamoto will resign if his plan isn't accepted. When the Army staff gave their support for the mid-Pacific strategy because it required them to provide only a small garrison force, the naval staff, for the second time in a year, capitulated to the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet. Nevertheless, they still insisted on continuing with their own South Pacific strategy at a slower pace. So, this second operational phase just might overstretch the resources of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Japan's main European ally is making grand plans too. On April 5th, Adolf Hitler issues Directive 41, his plans for the summer offensive versus the USSR. Fall Blau, Operation or Case Blue, will ideally first take Voronezh, then Stalingrad. They will reach the Caucasus by September and will build an eastern wall along the Volga. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin is convinced that the Axis powers will attack again towards Moscow. But here's Hitler's idea. In the Crimea, Erich von Manstein's 11th Army will destroy the Red Army holding at Kerch and then finally destroy Sevastopol with artillery. Fedor von Bock, who runs Army Group South, will erase the Izium pocket and grip Voronezh with armored pincers. He has 9 panzer divisions, 6 motorized divisions, and dozens of Romanian, Hungarian, Italian, and Slovakian divisions. After that, Army Group South will head down the River Don and cross the steppes to Stalingrad, backed with troops attacking from Kharkov. After all that, they would drive down to Baku, the oil city. Make no mistake, the reason for this is not just to take raw materials as one might think. Führer Directive 41 clearly states, our aim is to wipe out the entire defense potential remaining to the Soviets and to cut them off, as far as possible, from their most important centers of war industry. All available forces, German and Allied, will be employed in this task. And when listing the objectives, first, therefore, all available forces will be concentrated on the main operations in the southern sector, with the aim of destroying the enemy before the Don River in order to secure the Caucasian oil fields and the passes through the Caucasus Mountains themselves. The offensive will kick off as soon as the ground is hard enough for the tanks to cross in force. There is fighting this week in the USSR, though, particularly that against Manstein's 11th Army in the Crimea. There, Dmitry Kozlov's Crimean Front makes its 4th offensive. The Soviets have had trouble lately building up force because of greater Luftwaffe concentration in the region. On top of that, Manstein has gotten reinforcements. Lev Mechlis, Stalin's deputy, nevertheless insists on massed tank attacks versus unbroken German lines. And you can imagine how well that goes. At the end of the week, Kozlov calls off the attacks after huge losses. So far this year, Kozlov's front, including the troops under siege at Sevastopol, has lost roughly 350,000 men, 236,000 of them in the fighting for the Parpach Narrows from late February to now. That's 40% of his manpower, and he's also lost 50% of his armor. Axis casualties there so far this year are 24,120. That is a ratio of 14-1, and they still can't break out. But even without a breakout, the threat posed by 2 Soviet armies in Kerch was very real. The main threat to the 11th Army, which had to be eliminated. Soviet troops now set about building considerable fortifications. As Manstein had seen several times, they could be reinforced more or less at will. There are also German plans afoot for North Africa this week. I talked about Malta and North Africa a bit last week, and this week on the 7th, Smiling Albert Kesselring and Erwin Rommel meet and agree that a Tobruk-Malta or Malta-Tobruk offensive would have to be launched in late May or early June because of climate concerns, and they must be launched successively since there aren't enough planes to do them at the same time. It has the code name Hercules. Italian leader Benito Mussolini agrees to this the 12th, and Hitler will next week. And with that, this week comes to an end. A week that sees Japanese victory by both land and sea, and big Axis plans for making future attacks everywhere. And the mighty Kido Butai, the unstoppable Kido Butai, finishing its 2-week raid into the Indian Ocean, sinking a carrier, sinking 2 heavy cruisers, sinking tons and tons of merchant shipping, always triumphant. There is one funny thing. Those Blenheim bombers, well, they didn't do any damage to any Japanese carriers, but they did take the fleet by total surprise. Now, how did that happen? Well, they were not spotted by Japan's combat air patrol, who can't be everywhere at once, and the Japanese ships don't have radar. It is possible, just possible, mind you, that a lack of forewarning about the enemy might one day come back to haunt them. What am I saying? This is the mightiest fleet arm on Earth. that single-handedly ended the age of the battleship and ushered in the age of the aircraft carrier. Of course that couldn't happen. Of course not. Britain's colonial empire is very much in danger, but it had plenty of crises and ups and downs during the interwar era. If you'd like to see more about that, check out an episode about that from Between Two Wars, Season 1, right here. That's over at our Time Ghost channel. Our Time Ghost Army member of the week is Lee Coldfoot. It is people like Lee Coldfoot that make all of our content possible. So join the Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com and head on over to Indy's Tie Barn and you can get yourself one of my fantastic ties that I've worn on the air on YouTube that's up for auction this week. And do not forget to subscribe. I'll see you next time.